Today, we want to discuss industrialization in the least industrialized continent in Africa. So we, and I mean we in Austria and Europe, have seen from our own history that industrialization is fundamental to welfare and also sovereign economic development. And I think Karin will later on talk about that in a bit in further details. But most African countries could not really develop their industries. Some countries have even de-industrialized. Many countries still rely on the exports of unprocessed raw materials, be it fossil fuels, coal, oil, gas, but also minerals that might be needed for the decarbonization of the global economy. So I think the debates about industrial policies are definitely back on the political agenda. And I think, and I guess that we will talk about that there is also a great potential for a green industrialization in Africa. But where should the money come from for these big investments that are needed? And will already, so to say, industrialized countries share technologies to make that happen? Because leapfrogging is the word of the day. And a last thought, would green industrialization in Africa run counter to decarbonization of our own economy in the global north? It seems that we take it for granted that Africa will provide us with the raw materials we need to do that. This is, I think, another aspect, or maybe another aspect of climate colonialism, apart from our long history of polluting the world and the atmosphere, and also apart from the fact that we still tend to relocate our dirty productions to the global south. So after this very sketchy, very short frame for our discussion, let me finally introduce Karin Fischer. She will moderate this webinar. Karin is head of the Global Sociology and Development Research Unit at the Institute of Sociology at Johannes Kepler University, Linz, and she is a VIDC consultant. But may I hand over now to my colleague, Valentin Wedl from the Chamber of Labor, Vienna. Valentin is head of the EU and International Affairs Department. I hope he's coming now. Yes, he is there. Hello, Valentin. So the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Martina. And hello to everybody here. And I would like to welcome all of you on behalf of our institution, the Chamber of Labor. And I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar as well. So many of you might ask now, what in the world is the Chamber of Labor? Just in very brief, we are a big trade union think tank in Austria, a think tank of the employees movement. And among others, we are also a social partner institution, and we do have the right to deliver opinions on any legal motion in Austria. But moreover, we are acting internationally and as well on EU level. So at least 3 of our current activities are quite closely connected to today's webinar. One is that we are very busy on improving and campaigning labor rights and climate responsibilities in global supply chains with many other institutions at the moment. And it gives us a lot of hope that we might get some successes within the next month and years on this issue, which is of a very dynamic global nature. A second aspect is that we are criticizing all those unfair trade agreements between the European Union and other countries or other regions, for instance, the Mercosur agreement, or also the so-called economic partnership agreements with a lot of African countries. And we are recently very much occupied with the concept of, as we call it, a sort of a new great transformation, a socio-economic transformation that appears necessary in the light of our enormous challenges, be it in the context of the climate crisis or to overcome the corona pandemic. So talking about transformation, does not mean that we have a clear concept how to do this, but we know two things. We know that we can only meet them when we look at them as a social as well as a global challenge. So for today's event, I expect a lot of relevant input to get ahead on this subject and to get rid of several blind spots we are confronted with on this subject. So thank you very much, and I'm very happy to be with you tonight, and I'm very curious now about the conference and the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Valentin. Now it's my turn to say hello to everybody. Thank you for being with us. We will discuss an extremely important topic tonight, and that is industrialization, industrial policies in the global south, more concretely in Africa. And our common ground is that manufacturing matters. It was the Norwegian economist and historian Erik Reinert who said no country has ever developed without a manufacturing industry, except oil-producing countries, possibly, not sure. Or put it the other way around, a country without industry is doomed to poverty. And why is that? Martina has already framed our discussion. I want to mention just a few more points. Firstly, prices for industrial goods are higher and less volatile than for agricultural goods and raw materials. Secondly, an industrial base can mitigate external dependency, expand local markets, and strengthen regional cooperation. Thirdly, industry provides higher incomes on average than non-industrial sectors. And lastly, industry has forward and backward linkages. That means industrial sectors are linked to other sectors, fuel other branches, also to the agricultural sector and to services, and creates jobs. I leave it with that. But I think these preliminary remarks are important to make the common starting point for our discussion transparent. And that is, industrialization remains relevant for Africa in the 21st century. Our speakers, our podium, shares a manufacturing-oriented view on development, not ignoring problems, challenges, limitations. And we will, of course, discuss exactly about these. Martina has already said that we run a Q&A session during the webinar. Please use it. You are invited to pose questions during the inputs of our guests, and we will have a longer round of discussion at the end for at least 20 minutes. So let me introduce our distinguished speakers. Ozunimi, she works with the UNIDO. She is based around the corner in Vienna. She's a project manager in the environment department and coordinates UNIDO's efforts under the Partnership for Action on Green Economy and the Green Industry Initiative. And Pettifor is a political economist. She writes and speaks about the global economy and the international financial system, as finance, the economy, and the ecosystem are all tightly bound together. She recently wrote a book entitled The Case for the Green New Deal, the New Deal, not to be confused with the deal announced by the European Commission. Recently in 2019, in which she explains a roadmap for financial reform, which is crucial for a socio-ecological transformation, which Valentin has already mentioned. And last but not least, Abebe Shimeles. He is a division manager of the macroeconomic policy forecasting and research department of the African Development Bank. He has authored and co-authored several publications on today's topic, like Industrialize Africa, which practical policy advice to African countries, or Manufacturing Transformation, comparative studies of industrial development in Africa and emerging Asia, published by Oxford University Press. He's on from Nairobi. My first question goes to you, Abebe, and it is, in fact, a huge topic and a very big question, and I have to ask you to be short and precise. How would you describe the current state of industrial development or the presence of an industrial infrastructure on the African continent? What regional or national differences are reported here? Just to give us a short sketch, what is it about?
Thank you so much, Karin, and let me also thank the organizers for inviting me to this wonderful panel, joining distinguished panelists to speak about a topic which is very relevant and also close to my heart, Africa's transformation. And hopefully industrialization is one of the paths by which Africa can achieve those economic transformation. So I will look at in two parts what you have asked me. One is really to look at where Africa is when it comes to industrial development, and then to see what variation we may have to undertake the industrialization task across in the continent. One of the projects I was involved a few years back started with a question: why little industrialization in Africa? So we try to understand the underlying causes, mainly the ones relating to policy, because at the end of the day, it is the decision makers who are the principal players in promoting type of policy that is implemented in a country. So when it comes to Africa, industrialization is not a strange concept, actually. Immediately after independence, almost you could say all African leaders made a decision to pursue industrialization as their priority. So many experts believed few decades down the line, Africa would be an industrial power. So most of these countries followed in the 70s, 80s, and 90s what we call an import substitution industrialization strategy, whose objective is to create an industrial base in the domestic economy, primarily targeting the domestic market. So the effort was supported by what you call the infant industry argument, with high level of protection through tariffs, subsidies to the industries, and overvalued exchange. Unfortunately, this did not help, and that policy tragically failed. And as most of you know, immediately afterwards, Africa also faced what we call the growth crisis, which started in the 1970s. And as a result, the structural adjustment programs set in, therefore, for almost, you could say, 3 decades, not much has happened. And only in the mid-90s and early 2000s, many countries in Africa started to explore again the options of industrialization. So as it stands today, if you look at the simple, crude statistics about a country, the continent's status when it comes to industrialization, there isn't much to say, because the value added of the manufacturing sector, which is probably a good indicator of a country's involvement in industrial activities, is less than 14%. Now, if I just give you, for instance, the how you know, Africa is not the same throughout. It's a combination of 54 countries with different levels of development. So if we look at, for instance, some of the middle-income countries and a little bit also progressed in industrialization effort, Egypt, South Africa, they have actually de-industrialized over the years. If you look at the basic statistics on the share of employment in manufacturing, the share of value added in manufacturing, they have actually lost a bit. And then low-income countries with no natural resources, such as Ethiopia, for instance, Rwanda, really have done quite well in the last 2 decades when it comes to the expansion of the manufacturing sector. But then oil-rich countries like Nigeria and others in the West African and Central Africa countries de-industrialized. So generally, when you look at the bigger picture, the situation in Africa is much more than to be desired. Therefore, there is a big potential for catching up, but still there is also a gap in readiness of the continent to industrialize, which brings me to the second part of the question Karin asked me. I identify 3 readiness gaps for industrialization in Africa. One is the skill gap, a very important issue we have explored also in that long project. If you look at, just to give you a simple statistics, take tertiary education, the rest of the world average of the population that completed tertiary education is around 35% in 2018. North Africa about 30%, and Sub-Saharan Africa only 5%. So you could see tertiary education, which is an important platform to acquire knowledge, to run sophisticated industries and economic activities are very much lacking in many parts of the continent. If you look at infrastructure gap, it's huge. I mean, we can continue to cite factors. By what factors Africa is really falling behind. Just to give you one example, for instance, the frequency of power cuts in Africa costs about 13% of working hours on the average, while it is, for instance, 1% for East Asia, Eastern Europe and Central Asia 2%, Latin America 4%, and South Asia 6%. So there is so much for Africa without power, and we know the competitiveness advantage of any country or continent to undertake the manufacturing activity would be very difficult. And finally, the institutional effectiveness gap. There is so much many African countries need to do to attract the FDI, technology, and many other resources if the business climate is not attractive. So we can give various examples how Africa is lagging behind in terms of cultivating the environment for manufacturing firms to enter, to grow, and before they mature, they need to transform into middle and large scale firms. So this is basically the landscape where we are when it comes to industrialization in Africa. Thank you, Karin.
Thank you. But let me ask you a second question, Abebe, and that is about the African Continental Free Trade Area, which has become an African Union priority. Trading under the Free Trade Agreement started in January this year, and the new market is estimated to be as large as 1.3 billion people across Africa. So what about industrial policies in this regard? What do you expect from the trade pact with regard to industrial development?
Yes, I think our politicians and decision makers have been quite ambitious when it comes to regional integration. As you have mentioned, the Continental Free Trade Area literally has the ambition of removing all tariffs and providing full mobility of labor and capital throughout the continent. I think you agree with me, all of you, that if you think of in simple economic terms, this will definitely have tremendous potential for Africa's transformation. But it's also important when it comes to the implementation. There are so many practical difficulties, which I would like just to mention a few. One, just look at the geography of Africa. 84% of the countries in Africa share borders with one or two countries. This is the highest anywhere in the world. And then there is so much ethno-linguistic fractionalization. That means bordering countries speak so many languages and so many barriers, cultural and otherwise. Therefore, the evidence when it comes to regional integration in Africa has had different success stories. So some regions have done very well, probably like South African region, and a little bit in the West Africa and East Africa region. But in places like North Africa and Central Africa, still the pace is quite slow. That said, the place for industrial policy actually is central to promote and even strengthen the African continental free trade area. Just to give you an example, already many countries sharing borders are collaborating and coordinating industrial parks, export processing zones, power sharing, for instance, particularly in Eastern and Western Africa, in even Southern Africa. Some countries get their electricity supplies from neighboring countries. And there is a bit of also value chain integration in the processing of light manufacturing, for instance, processing of in the textile industry and in some other chemicals industry, where you could see without even proper trade agreements, countries are collaborating out of necessity. So I'm thinking, and probably that is also what the African Union is thinking. Recently, they were supposed to undertake what you call the Africa Industrialization Decade. In that context, the African Continental Free Trade project would ride over actually a Pan-African industrial policy, which we don't have, which we don't yet have. So my sense is it will come naturally for countries to think through the supply chain, especially the COVID-19 has shown, the pandemic has shown the significance of regional integration, but also industrial integration, both in markets, in processing, in supply chains, in processing, etc. So my sense is you are right. The AFTA has not explicitly indicated industrial policy in the documents if you read through, but I believe a Pan-African industrial policy is also an imperative to achieve that goal. Thank you.
Thank you, Abebe, for drawing this overall picture. I'm sure we will come back on these points. Let me proceed. Industrialization, as important as it is, should not create new problems. And that's where we enter the environmental dimension of industrialization. For us, in our thought collective, it is clear that over-consuming societies, high-income countries must bear the greatest burden of climate change adaptation. But what seems to happen, and we have that in our title, what seems to happen is a new form of climate colonialism. Martina has already talked about the outsourcing practices of northern corporations which outsource the most carbon intensive industries or dirty industries elsewhere. This kind of carbon leakage, so to say, or climate colonialism could even be increased in the way that powerful rich countries exploit Africa's resources to boost our own energy transition, lithium, copper, rare earth metals, whatever you need to make electricity out of solar power or wind power comes from Africa and or countries of the global south. And lastly, rich countries' climate policies are dubbed by I don't remember who it was in the aftermath of the COP26 meeting. I read it in the Financial Times that Norway, along with other Nordic and Baltic countries, has been lobbying the World Bank to stop all financing of natural gas projects in Africa as soon as 2025, and until then only in exceptional circumstances. So at COP26, and Anne might talk about that later on, at COP26, 20 countries went even further, pledging to stop all funding for overseas fossil fuel projects beginning next year. So while Norway makes good money out of its gas and oil exports, it imposes restrictions on poor countries in Africa and elsewhere. So Ozunimi, under such difficult circumstances, what scope and possibilities for action do you see for green industrial policies in Africa? So what building blocks are important with regard to green industrial development? Which actors could take meaningful and important actions with regard to greening industrialization?
Thank you, Karin, for those questions. And I would also like to thank the organizers for inviting me as a speaker to this event. So I would like us to take a step back a little bit and look at what the global challenge is. Since the 18th century, the world has emitted over 1.5 trillion tons of carbon dioxide, chiefly from transport and industry. Now, Africa is responsible for only 3% of that, with the largest contributors being North America at 29%, Asia at roughly the same amount, and Europe at around 33%. While most of those individual countries responsible have achieved a high level of development, we know that Africa lags behind on human development indices and is home to 2/3 of the global poor. So basically, Africa really needs industrialization to be able to improve the living conditions of its people. We cannot escape that. At the same time, the continent is the most vulnerable to the effects of climate change. When we consider all of this, plus the scenarios that you just mentioned, and when you add the economic pressures of the pandemic on top of that, it is a very difficult situation that African countries find themselves in if they want to industrialize and grow economically, but at the same time do that in a way that is considered green. Nevertheless, I still see some scope for green industrialization and the development of green industrial policies. But African countries would need to find that fine balance between pursuing a viable industrialization path that drives economic growth and maximizing green industrialization. So when we talk about green industrial policies, we are simply talking about any government measure that tries to accelerate the structural transformation towards a low carbon and resource efficient economy in ways that also enable productivity enhancements in the economy. So you see that there's the environmental and the economic aspect at the very least, but I must add that social issues should also be thoroughly examined because there can be positive and negative there are a lot of positive externalities, positive social outcomes of green industrialization. Now, for countries, African countries that are considering green industrial policies, their objectives will probably be some or all of the following. One, to provide renewable energy sources for critical industries. For example, maybe green hydrogen for steel production. Or two, to make resource efficiency improvements. Three, energy efficiency improvements. Four, to reduce process emissions. An example could be substituting cement clinker with more sustainable materials. Five, to reduce pollution, air, solid effluents, etc. And six, to provide green goods and services. Now, based on country context, an African country could decide to do some or all of these, to focus on some or all of these objectives. Now, there was a comparison taken from Partnership for Action on Green Economy flagship publication on green industrial policy concepts that shows green product and service opportunities for countries at different income levels. Basically, they propose for higher middle income countries that they could focus on more high-tech components of renewable energy technologies, such as concentrated solar power, maybe wind turbines, geothermal technologies, electric vehicles, bioplastics, carbon capture, and storage, etc. And for lower and middle income countries, they talked more about things like solar water heaters, solar pumps, LNG-based taxis, etc. So the basic idea is that African countries shouldn't try to do everything, but should target those activities that fit their own economic and social context best. And then another study done by the African Circular Economy Alliance in conjunction with the AFDB and Dalberg looked at the parameters circularity potential. They looked at economic significance, transformative impact, and they found that agriculture, manufacturing, and construction are the most promising circular economy sectors out there for Sub-Saharan Africa. So there are a number of quite general studies out there that can form a guide for African countries. But then, of course, we have to ask ourselves, how should they go about this? What strategies could an African country take when they try to approach green industrial policy development? What I could suggest are one, evidence-based planning. So African countries really need to assess their sectors thoroughly, identify the best activities and technologies for green industrialization that really fit their local context and could result in economic gains and job creation. They should then work around policies that encourage development of those sectors and try to channel resources towards them. So for example, Morocco plans to achieve over 50% renewable energy mix by 2030. They already achieved a 37% mix. And they made investments in solar, wind power, not just on the installation side, but in manufacturing components. So for example, wind turbine blades. Now, the motivation for Morocco comes largely from wanting to reduce their reliance on fossil fuel importation, but it's also based on their significant renewable energy potential. Recently, their Ministry of Energy and Environment and IRENA announced a partnership to carry out green hydrogen studies and explore policy instruments to engage the private sector in the industry. So you see, they're thinking ahead and carrying out studies based on their national context and what they have set out to achieve in the future. A second approach they should take is to align with green goals. So they have to align their national economic policies and also pandemic recovery policies with green goals within their own national context. This means aligning with the sectors and activities they have identified, the sustainable development goals, nationally determined contributions, as well as the realities of the international climate financing landscape. This way, they will be able to put their resources to the right sectors and position themselves to attract financing and investments from partners whose goals align strategically with theirs. So I will give you a case of the Rwanda, where their latest economic development and poverty reduction strategy talked about promoting the green economy through the promotion of green innovation in industrial and private sectors. And as a consequence, they established the Rwanda Green Fund in 2012 to support the financing of their green transition. In 2020, they established one of the first state-of-the-art e-waste recycling facilities on the continent, which is called, I think, EnviroServe Rwanda, financed by this fund. And the facility is currently processing 4,000 tons of e-waste per year and employing more than 600 workers. Under full capacity, the facility could employ more than 1,000 workers. So that's just one example. 3, African countries should also try to build stronger partnerships. Really try to seek out partnerships, for example, in the extractive sector that are built around extractive raw materials amidst investments in clean technology, localizing their value chains and building skills. For example, they could strengthen their local content policies to make them pursue more green objectives, value addition, to generate green jobs. An example is Botswana, which pursued value addition to their diamond business, expanding downstream in the value chain by introducing targets for local processing. Now, this may not seem very green at face value, but it's just an expression of the kind of local content policy that African countries could consider in their approach towards developing green industrial policies. Although I must say, moving downstream to add value in the supply chain of most products is often greener. I think African countries need to also work more with the extractive industry. The extractive industry has the kind of investment power that is needed to drive large-scale deployment of green technologies. And at the same time, they are a major contributor to pollution. So I think it is fair that they should be involved some more in trying to improve green industrialization on the continent. So, for example, Morocco, which is one of the world's largest phosphate producers, is planning a green ammonia plant powered by green hydrogen. So basically working with the primary producers who are also going to invest in this. They've already built a pilot plant producing 4 tons of green hydrogen and are planning to take this to industrial levels. And this, is same for major oil and gas producing countries in Africa. They have an opportunity to participate in the green hydrogen value chain with their existing midstream infrastructure, which includes pipelines, ships, storage facilities. Now, having said that, policies also need to be put in place to ensure that the existing extractive operations are made cleaner. Another aspect that I think is important for African countries is regional planning. Abebe talked about the Continental Free Trade Agreement, but how would that really result in industrial development or green industrial development if there are not enough networks between African countries? Roads, rail, even air traffic is just not at the right level. So I think African countries need to put in place the right infrastructure to accelerate regional trade and regional financing as well. I would also propose some kind of regional and sub-regional planning where the continent really looks at their industrial needs, on a wider level. Say the West African region could look at their needs and say, how many steel plants do we really need as a region? Which countries are the best countries to focus on this? And then they really concentrate their efforts on what makes sense for those particular countries. Of course, there's also the issue of green infrastructure. The good thing about Africa is that because there is this lack of infrastructure, because there is this low industrial base, we have the opportunity to do things right by learning from the mistakes of other regions. So the countries could look into eco-industrial parks, developing policies on promoting eco-industrial parks, which could provide the same kind of benefits in clustering that regular industrial parks provide, such as access to technologies or energy, increased export capability, competitiveness, etc., but at the same time, reduce greenhouse gas emissions and pollution. Now, the last point I wanted to talk about when it comes to the approach was green financing, but I won't say too much about this since we have someone here who is more experienced in that area. I will only say that African countries could pool resources more and create green funds that would specifically target green activities on the continent. We saw the example of the Rwanda Green Fund, which was established in 2012 to support the financing of Rwanda's green transition. The fund is financed by both public and private contributions, as well as through donor contributions, and has invested in a number of successful initiatives, including the e-waste facility that I mentioned before. Now, for green industrialization to happen, we still need the basics. And I think Abebe mentioned some of them. We still need the basics like in regular industrialization. So we need adequate infrastructure, transport, power supply, a good business and investment climate, skills, all coming together to produce tradable products and services and job creation at scale. The difference is that we try to apply that green filter wherever possible. So you want to use renewable energy, you want to use green technologies, you want to maximize resource efficiency, etc. And that's where green industrial policies come in. And green industrial policies themselves also use similar tools as regular industrial policies. But again, we are looking at them through a green lens and trying to incentivize green actions. So there could be a mix of market-based instruments, which could be things like taxes, charges, tradable permits, etc. You could have voluntary instruments like extended producer responsibility schemes. Sorry, those are regulatory, mandatory extended producer responsibilities schemes. Other voluntary take-back schemes are possible. Information-based instruments as well, like labeling, eco-labeling as well. So those are just some of the examples of instruments that could be used in green industrial policies. Oh, you talked about actors. I've mentioned several actors already. Government, private sector, funds, international bodies. But there are others, including industry associations, for example, who would play a critical role in setting standards and taking voluntary actions, academia, women's associations, the public.
Could you be more concrete, Ozunimi? I mean,
yes.
You mentioned Rwanda, you mentioned Morocco.
Yeah.
Who are the actors who are pushing for this agenda? Could you name some more concretely?
Who are pushing for the green industrial policy agenda? Is that what you mean? Well, yes, in general, you could have industry associations. I think in Western nations, you have strong public involvement in green, in trying to push the green agenda. In Africa, it's a bit different. We are more of facing the externalities, I think, that are coming from the West, international agreements and all sorts. There is less, I think, public pressure as it is in the West, partly because in Africa, we are generally pursuing our activities in a cleaner way. But you have industry associations as well. But essentially, all parties need to work together and be consulted, especially in the policy development process. I have to add as well quickly that gender and green industrial policies must be gender responsive. And gender considerations have to be mainstream into the development of all green industrial policies. And African governments need to ensure that both men and women are consulted during the policy development process. I'm sure we've all heard about this 2015 McKinsey study that found that $12 trillion could be added to global GDP by 2025 by advancing women's equality. Now, if you look at the average labor force participation of women in Africa, in 2019, this was 56.1%. In contrast, for men, it was 72.4%. So you see that there is this gap there, and women are just not participating enough in the labor force, and that also contributes to low economic performance. And that's one reason why UNIDO, with funding support from the government of Germany, recently published a study advising policymakers and practitioners in 4 countries, including Senegal and South Africa, on the establishment and implementation of policy frameworks integrating gender into green industry policies. And this study is supposed to help women to take leadership roles, either as entrepreneurs or green industry professionals. Now, if we consider that the manufacturing industry also contributes 25% to the global workforce, the opportunity it could provide as a potential driver of green jobs and also to engage more women in productive activities is very evident. And I would say that having green jobs is indeed possible. A similar facility to the one in Rwanda I mentioned was established in Kenya in 2013, creating 2,000 green jobs in the first 4 years of operation. Another example is the Switch Med initiative, which was an initiative of UNEP and UNIDO, which were launched in 2013 to speed up the shift to sustainable consumption and production patterns in the Southern Mediterranean. And that included 4 North African countries. That program created 1,000 new green jobs and 200 green companies. So in a nutshell, what am I saying? Can green industrialization combat green colonialism? Yes, it can. But African countries really need to prioritize their industrialization needs. And they need to recognize that they are not just protecting their natural environment, but also guaranteeing sustainable economic growth. And they need to recognize the growing call for environmental sustainability as well. And the fact that their products may not be able to sell on the international market anymore if they don't take action. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ozunimi. Thank you very much. We have already a question in the Q&A section about colonialism, but I want to ask Anne before that success of industrial policies does not rely on Africa or these initiatives we heard now alone. It is about macroeconomics. It is about the rules of the game. So I would like to ask you, thinking of an interview you gave, that we have to think about macroeconomics, the economic system and its link to the ecosystem, and what kind of economic framework or financial system do we need to tackle the global climate breakdown? Do you suggest a new Bretton Woods? So what are your ideas about a new financial architecture to deal with those challenges?
Sure. Thank you ever so much. I'm really honored to be on this panel with these distinguished panelists and to discuss this incredibly important subject. And I would like to thank Karin, VIDC, for this opportunity, because it's a subject very dear to my heart. So I'm very honored to be here. I wanted to start with something that Nimi said, which is that when we're thinking about an industrial policy, we must go back to basics. And I would like to go back to basics when thinking about Africa. And I will talk about the macroeconomic situation and the international framework, but I want to start with the African framework. So the big problems that Africa faces at the moment, and I speak particularly of my country, South Africa, are first of all, very high levels of unemployment, extraordinary high levels of unemployment. You know, in the 1920s and 30s in the United States, when unemployment hit 25%, they came close to revolution, right? But in South Africa, unemployment now is officially 34%. Unofficially, amongst young people, it's 44, closer to 50%. That is obscene levels of unemployment. And it's not just the case in South Africa, other countries and I'm thinking of Nigeria, have this problem too. So it's a very high problem, very serious problem of unemployment. It's a very serious problem, as I think Abebe was pointing out, of low educational attainment. There's a need for education, basically, and for the upskilling of Africans. And then there's the climate crisis. It's very serious, and it's affecting Africa perhaps worse than many other continents when you think of the degradation of the soil around the Sahel and the Sahara, but also further south, you think of the floods and so on. These are devastating for Africans. So I think we do have to go back to basics. And I want here to revive the reputation of an African economist who is often ignored, Abdul Rahman Mohammed Babu, who was an advisor to President Nyerere in the 1970s when I lived in Dar es Salaam and taught in a secondary school in Dar es Salaam. Babu was very influential at those times. He was, for example, responsible for raising the finance to bring in the Tazara railway line, and built a railway line from Dar es Salaam across through Zambia and so on, which was really important for development in East Africa. And he argued correctly, in my view, that all the Western economies had industrialized on the basis of 4 or 5 pillars, basically. The first pillar was that they learned to feed their people. In other words, they developed their agricultural sectors so that their people could be fed and they could be self-sufficient in food. Secondly, they ensured that their people could be housed. They developed construction, industrial construction, in order so that people had decent housing, and terribly important at times of climate instability. Thirdly, they ensured that people had clothing. So textile industries were another major pillar of industrialization in the West. Then there was education. Education was an important pillar for industrialization because it was upskilling workers and developing and innovation and so on and so forth. There are other basic needs that Africans need, but in my view, if African governments focused on those, building those four pillars as the foundations of an industrial strategy, we would go a very long way to ensuring the sustainability of Africa, and in particular, of creating employment for those millions of young people that have no hope and no jobs at the moment. So that's the one dimension. And then I want to look at the international dimension. And the fact of the matter is that Africa has signed up to international treaties which make the kind of partnerships that I think, was it Nimi or was it Abebe that was talking about partnerships with, for example, the extractive industries. These partnerships are almost impossible to achieve for Africa to leverage because of the investor-state dispute settlement agreements that African governments have entered into. And no doubt unwillingly, and I know there have been big arguments about this, quite rightly so, but this is the immense power that governments worldwide have given to corporations to put them on the same level as states, as governments, and to give those corporations enormous powers. Now, I'm quite sure that one of the reasons that COP26 was such a great disappointment was that many states were threatened by corporations with huge demands for reparations if anything could be done to damage their profitability. So if an industry is engaged in extraction in the Congo, and we wanted to do so in a more sustainable way, or the government, if they should want to, demand for more sustainable level of extraction and for substituting jobs and increasing job creation locally and offsetting some of that extraction, if you like, the government of the Congo has absolutely virtually no leverage over those corporations, thanks to these international treaties and agreements. So that's part of the problem, and that's part of the reason why we have to transform the international system before we can give African governments the policy autonomy they need to enter into those sorts of agreements. We've got to reconstruct, in my view, the international framework, which has so empowered private corporations over governments, and you know, so that we are now effectively governed by these corporations and not by our governments. Why there is so much disillusionment with the political process and with democracy. And then I want to look at the international financial system. And I want to give an example of, for example, the Great Green Wall Initiative, which is the planting of trees around the Sahel, across the Sahel and the Sahara. Now that seems to me to be an amazing and wonderful project. I regard it as the legacy of one of my heroines and a dear friend, Wangari Maathai, who was, of course, the great tree planter of Africa and won the Nobel Prize for her tree planting. So this idea of building a great green wall across the Sahel and Sahara is a most enlightened idea, but let's look at the way it's being financed. One would think that the French government and the Costa Rican governments and the others that are involved in the financing of this project would be offering grant aid for the planting of these trees, because everyone will gain from the management of the Sahara and the Sahel. Everyone north of Africa and in Africa itself will gain from that stabilization of the climate in that region. But there is no way that there's a grant, that this money is, this wall is being financed by grants. Instead, it's being financed privately by private funders. And what is happening is that on the one hand, as Professor Daniela Gabor has shown, on the one hand, financial institutions, massive financial institutions based in the stratosphere, you know, globalized stratosphere, beyond the reach of regulatory democracy, are willing to invest money to plant trees across the Sahel but they don't want to do that as grants. They want to ensure that they can generate returns on that investment over time. Quite what that will mean, I'm not sure of yet, but it's going to mean that the people in that region benefiting from that tree planting are going to have to find the money to reward the private investors for those investments. But the really dismal thing about this is that at the same time, those investors are unwilling to invest in the Green Wall and to create an initiative which they've called, what is the name they've given it? They've given it something like, it's an initiative for desertified land, and it's got its name. They've set up a fund for that, and they're demanding that Western governments should de-risk their investment in that fund. So on the one hand, they're expecting public taxpayer-funded resources to back their initiative so that they do not face the risk of losses. And on the other hand, they've set up a fund which they expect to generate returns over time. Now, this is how the global financial system operates now. And within that system, it's really, really hard for Africa to obtain affordable investment, affordable funds, which are not going to, in the future, strip her of even more, extract even more of her finite assets. So for me, it's a bit delusional to ask African governments to do this, to that, to industrialize, to build this, to engage in investment and so on and so forth, because African governments have had their hands tied and they lack the power and the policies to do this, to undertake this transformation that is so important to the survival of humanity in Africa. And that is why I want us to be arguing, and I would like African governments to be arguing on the international stage for a transformation of this system. Quite how we do that when you know, laws have been created and that give corporations such enormous power and such enormous leverage over governments. But you know, those were human created, those were man-made laws. They can be man-unmade too. Right. And until we start thinking about that, I think it's delusional for us to say that Africa should improve its opportunities for creating employment for its people by investing and industrializing. That's not really going to happen. So I want to see a change, and I want to see the change where governments decide that full employment is a priority. Right now, full employment is not a priority. It's not embedded in, for example, central bank mandates. Governments don't regard full employment as the right targets to be pursuing. They think it's far more important to be targeting foreign investment, for example. And that has to change. The creation of jobs for the African people, and in particular for the African youth, has to be a priority for governments. And secondly, you know, African governments can begin the process of feeding their people, you know, where there is the capacity for agriculture in Africa is immense, and it's not used properly because African governments are encouraged to export their agriculture and not use it for feeding their people. The capacity for creating homes, decent homes that are, you know, resilient to climate change, that is something that could be done at home in Africa by African people. Health is more complicated. We've seen through the pandemic that it's almost impossible for African governments to secure the health of their people. And I've watched the South African government desperately wanting to protect their people from this pandemic, which is something that they were not actually responsible for. But they cannot manage their exchange rate. Their exchange rate is determined by Wall Street. And so the minute the pandemic was announced, money flooded out of South Africa and went straight to strengthen the dollar and weaken the rand. That made it really difficult for South African governments to purchase from global pharmaceutical companies the medications, the vaccines needed to protect their people, just for a start. Secondly, interest rates rose as the currency fell. And so borrowing from international pharmaceutical companies became so much more expensive and risky, right? And then there's international protection, intellectual protection law. You know, today globalization isn't about industrialization. Western governments are not interested in industrialization. They're interested in intellectual property, and they're interested in government states, taxpayers providing protection for that intellectual property. So if you think about Bill Gates is not interested in ensuring that everybody has a computer and has access to the internet. He's interested in ensuring that every single computer he sells in the world will pay rent back to him. Every piece of software, I pay rent to Bill Gates on every piece of software that I use from Microsoft, and I do it on a regular basis. He collects the rent, and that has made him one of the wealthiest people, and his company one of the wealthiest people in the world. So today, the global economy and the global financial system is geared around rentier capitalism. Capitalism is not interested in investing and creating and innovating. It's interested in collecting rent on existing assets, not producing new assets, right? And so we find that in Western economies are determined not to end competition at home. They don't care about competition at home. They want monopolies built at home, such as the Silicon Valley monopolies, so that they can compete globally. And that's more important to them than maintaining competition at home. And so in these conditions, it is really, really difficult to see how even, you know, well-intentioned African governments can actually secure employment, housing security, and health security for their people. But until African governments begin to prioritize those policies and prioritize those, then there will not be development, industrial or otherwise, in Africa. And we will, you know, continue to effectively be colonized by private global corporations, and that has to end. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Anne. That was partly an answer to Edith Schnitzer. She asked, what can African governments do to tax, to regulate monopolies, foreign corporations? Yeah. That was partly an answer, but I would like to bring in Abebe. What do you say? What would you answer to Edith? How can African countries conquer foreign monopolies?
Well, you know, it takes two to tango. Those guys don't operate alone. They have partners here in crime. So I think I like Anne's political economy approach to the bigger scheme of things. I would like also to just, you know, as much as the external environment is not conducive, it's also important for us to recognize we have also a fair share of the blame as leaders, as policymakers within the continent. Look at the illicit financial flows from Africa.
Yeah.
It's a huge amount. Even some of the countries you wouldn't suspect. I am Ethiopian, and you know, that country, billions and billions of dollars have been siphoned and illicitly taken out of the country by all the elites. So globally, I mean, at the continental level, even United Nations estimates close to $100 billion leave the continent. And then you bring in the institutional setup within the continent. I think Africa can, and Africans can take that destiny of the economy First, by fixing the internal coordination issues in terms of prioritizing the needs of the citizens, employment, decent housing, etc. It doesn't take a rocket science to fix it. The only thing you need is really a committed and also transparent and accountable government. So a bit is circular, of course, but I have seen it in my own country. There is a government now which is really committed to do things. We are building a dam out of the pockets of poor mothers and fathers, costing us 5 billion. And I'm very proud to say over 30% of that is funded from the citizens themselves. And still, we are fighting for our soul, just because the global crime cabal is sabotaging the country from aspiring for an independent and hopefully prosperous country. So it can be done. Many countries have shown. There are some sparkling examples within the continent. When you have that rare combination of committed leadership, Africans can rise to the challenge. So it's much better for the continent to look inside the strengths, the potentials that we have. And of course, the external environments, the big corporations and all of those play the game because they see the weakness in the institutions that we have. So hopefully this situation changed by Africans themselves. I don't expect the global corporate world to reform itself. It's impossible. We have seen it. The 2008 collapse is a classic example of greed that has completely cared for nobody. I mean, today it's a memory, but I think millions of Americans, Europeans lost their life savings and were thrown into poverty just because of this global elite were beyond the powers and the regulators. So I agree with Anne. I mean, there is this political economy factor. It's complex, it's not tractable, but we know the moral duties lies on citizens like ours to enlighten our people and pay the sacrifice that's needed so that we build a strong institution that's capable of utilizing the potential. So when it comes to the green technology, it's not either or that. I think for Africa, for instance, some countries, green technology is even more efficient than the fossil-based energy. Again, take Ethiopia, for instance. It has a lot of hydro power potential, wind power potential, natural gas potential, and the country doesn't even use, electricity. Ethiopia is 100% hydropower ever since, before even anybody talked about green technology. Come to places like, for instance, Kenya. Now they are farming, wind farming is going on, hydroelectricity is coming. And Morocco and Egypt, they are harvesting solar technology because it's cheaper. It's 24-hour sunshine. So for many African countries along the Sahel and the Congo Basin, and even Southern Africa, South Africa doesn't need coal to run its technology, its economy. There is so much cheaper, renewable and green technologies they can apply. Only the big corporations are refusing to reform. Even for South Africa, the load shedding story is a simple case of corruption. So I believe political economy is in the driver's seat. So the people like Anne, I think they have Your task is out there for you, but I think you are on the right track. Thanks.
Thank you.
That was also an answer to Franz, who was asking about the energy transition. We might come back to that, what happens to oil exporters on the continent. But I want to refer to a word you said, Abebe, that Africa should look inside, that it should look at the own strength, and that is the question, I think, of Katharina Bili. She said should Africa embark on an industrialization path like we did the northern countries? Is that the solution? And I was thinking of a very important document, the Declaration of Kokoyok, from the beginning of the 1970s, written by African leaders and critical development theorists, calling for a collective self-reliance, talking about preserving the common goods like nature, the ocean, resources, and to focus on basic needs. Feeding the people, like Anne said. What do you think about that argument, about looking inside and being more focused on the satisfaction of basic needs than leapfrogging, technological leapfrogging? That question goes to all of you. Maybe Ozunimi want to ask, and Abebe as well, of course. Anne?
Yeah, I can come in quickly
Karin.
On this one. Anne earlier mentioned the pillars for industrialization starts from meeting basic needs of the population, which the Western countries have done. And I think Asia has also done, because you see, it's also economics. If a country wants to embark on industrialization paths, especially heavy industrialization, which accompanies urbanization, then the wage goods, the food, and the basic necessities clauses become important. They have to be affordable. They have to be easily accessible to the working population. Otherwise, that's why sometimes, for instance, some African manufacturing goods are not very competitive. I remember a case of a Chinese company that set up a factory in Addis for shoes, which they sell in New York. The first thing they noticed was the wages were very low compared to China, and that was the attraction, and electricity was cheaper, and transport was cheaper. But then the wage good, when they realized that the workers entirely their wage, they were spending on food. Actually, they were not even able to get 2 meals a day. So they immediately set up a canteen in the factory, providing free food for all workers, including coffee breaks and all of this. And then productivity boomed. And for them, it was cheaper. So the idea of meeting basic needs is crucial in my view, and it's also human, I think.
But also, Abebe, it's also that it can be done locally. You know, you can get your resources for building a house from your bricks can be made locally. You can grow your food locally, and you know, you can also grow cotton locally, in my view. But the point is, and I think that's also more sustainable. This idea that we always have to import everything or export everything, and it has to be flown across from China to Tanzania, when actually Tanzania could make it at home, and by those means create jobs for Tanzanians. That's the key thing. You know, what we're doing is creating jobs for the Chinese, or creating jobs for countries in Eastern Europe, but not for people at home. And that's because we don't think creating jobs is important at home. We think it's important to get cheap shoes or cheap textiles. So I think it's about, you know, the Green New Deal, which is what I'm writing about, is that everywhere we have to learn to be more localized. And it really matters because Western economies are based on extracting wealth from poor countries in order for us to maintain our living standard. Every time I have a cup of coffee in the morning, I'm extracting from the rainforests of either Brazil or the Congo. Every time I eat chocolate, I'm extracting resources from Ghana and from somewhere in Latin America. The fact of the matter is I must learn here to live on what we can provide here locally. I don't have to always have those exotic foods which require the extraction of assets from, for example, subtropical area. Now, that's not to say we shouldn't have trade. That's not to say there shouldn't be some distribution of chocolate around the world. But we here we expect to have we don't expect to grow our own food. We expect to import it all the time. And it's that construction of the global economy, which is export oriented, and also that, you know, that it must satisfy all the demands of and the wants, the desires of Western consumers, that has made the economy so unbalanced, but has also led to massive extraction of, for example, the rainforests, which in turn is the thing that has led to the, what do they call it, the zoonotic spillovers, where we raid the forests where wild animals live and we end up getting infected by their viruses, you know. So these things are all connected and we have to change the way we think about consuming. Not
Ozunimi, what is your opinion on that?
Yes, indeed, like everyone said, industrialization is about providing the basics. I mean, how do you feed your population? If you think about pharmaceuticals as well, we are right now in the middle of a pandemic and African countries cannot lay their hands on enough vaccines for their population exactly because they do not have the right facilities or intellectual property to be able to produce the vaccines by themselves. So industrialization is critical. It's very critical for the basics. What you have right now in the Western world is well beyond the basics. You've gone into the realm of, you know, being extra comfortable where you can, you know, replace your mobile phone every year or every 2 years. That's not what we are talking about in Africa. And hopefully, if we plan properly, we don't get to that point where we are just consuming and not thinking about our future. And if I just go back a little bit to a point that was raised about the international political climate, yes, we know the pressures on Africa based on international politics, but there's a lot we can do for ourselves. If you noticed, I talked a lot about planning. Planning and dedication does not cost too much. So that is the first thing we can do, the very first for ourselves, which is to be very dedicated to the cause, to plan properly so that even when you get these agreements in front of you, you put all your ducks in a row, you know what you're signing and you know how to say no, and you have the evidence because you have done your evidence-based planning. You have the evidence to back up your arguments when you say no, we cannot do this. So basically that's it. We should first of all be dedicated to our own agenda and be sure of that agenda, what it is.
Yeah.
We have even more questions in the Q&A section and they grow even longer. I think you have partly answered the question of Abaramogesi. Your answers go in the direction that it is important to create local markets or regional markets. And I think it was Abebe who said this is, of course, a political question of cooperation. So this is not an economic question, but to create regional integration projects is about politics, right? Yeah. But we have also a question on the role of the NGOs and civil society in the process of green industrialization that was upgraded. So I want to pose that question to you. It was posed by Edith. What is the role of NGOs and civil society associations, and how can you convince people to advocate green industries or to embark on this development path?
Yeah.
Ozunimi, will you
yes,
proceed?
I will take that one.
Yeah.
NGOs have a very, very critical role to play. They often are the ones who put pressure on governments in Africa where there is any form of pollution, or, they tend to be the first focus groups that really, really put pressure on the government to say, no, things have to be done right. So that's one side. But of course, there are different types of NGOs. You also have the industry associations who also try to maintain standards when it comes to industrialization. So it's not just about creating pressure, but also trying to make sure that industry themselves are working in the right way. How do you convince the public? When we talk about green industrialization, especially for Africa, it does not mean that we ignore the basics. It simply means that we try to put that green lens wherever possible to our efforts in industrialization. So we don't try to do everything. You don't try to, a lower middle income country or low income country doesn't suddenly try to jump to try to do green hydrogen or something, but you start where you are based on the kind of development needs and the context within your own country. So how do you convince people? You convince people that it's the right thing. Nobody likes to see waste. I think one thing that many Africans can relate to is nobody likes to see solid waste piling up in their community. So if you can convince people that, look, we have to recycle some of these things. We have to engage people. If we have a recycling facility, we could engage more of the public. We could have create jobs for people, and also we could have a cleaner environment for our children so that they don't get sick. So we're not trying to convince people with high-tech solutions, but convince them about things that really fit in with the development needs of African countries.
You want to add on that, Anne or Abebe?
No.
Abebe?
No,
Convince the public.
We agree with that.
Okay, that's fine. We have 4 minutes left, which is not much. And I think our discussion gives us a lot of material for further discussions on that topic. This is for sure. I just have a look at the Q&A section, which you can do as well, because the questions are quite long. In fact, there are statements. We have 2 questions about the energy sector. Maybe we can pick up this subject.
Yeah, can I?
Yeah, and do that.
I think, I mean, I agree with, I think it was you saying it in the introduction, Karin, that this colonialism of, we've got to eliminate investment in gas and coal and so on in other countries, but don't worry, here at Norway, we're going to carry on exploiting oil and so on. That, of course, is fair. What I think is really important is that Africa is going to have to, at some point, contribute to, and it's already happening, as Nimi is saying, that countries are already moving towards more sustainable energies. And as Abebe showed, with hydropower, that's already happening. Ghana, for example, has excellent hydropower and so on. So this process is already happening. But it seems to me that what's really important is that we should have plan for transition. What we're not talking about, I'm thinking of Nigeria here, and I'm thinking of the area in the south where, the oil companies have so despoiled the environment, not just the environment, but society there. and so led to such imbalances in the Nigerian economy. You know, the Nigerian economy used to be self-sufficient in terms of agriculture and food, but with the discovery of oil, that was lost, and the skills were disappeared and so on. So that rebalancing has to take place in countries like Nigeria. But what's really important is, how do we plan for the transition? And I think what Nimi was saying, planning is something that African governments can do. And what we saw at COP26 was that everybody talked about targets. Let's go for this target or that target. And targets are all very well, but what's much more difficult is, what are the steps to take so that we get to the point where we can use maybe natural gas, for developing more cleaner forms of energy? And how do we go about doing that? And more, what's the word? More direct, what is the word I want? I'm looking for more, you know, downsizing energy, so we don't have these enormous, huge corporations providing, but we have more localized supplies of energy. But that takes planning, and we're not talking about that yet. COP26 didn't talk at all about what steps to take in the transition. It's as if we're expected to go from here to there by tomorrow. And that is crazy. And that certainly is not right for Africa, because as Nimi said at the beginning, Africa has every right also to develop and to ensure, for example, that her people have work, sustainable work and income and health and education, all of those things, which are really important to human security.
Downsizing might be an answer to Erwin Künzi. He's talking about monopolies on the national level, and they do exist as well. Yeah. Abebe has talked about import substitution, industrialization of the 1960s, 70s. We had big monopolies on the domestic markets as well. Yeah. Planning, very important. I have a look. Well, anything you want to add, Abebe? We have so interesting statements.
There was one question actually addressed directly to me. How to develop the human capital, for instance, and then also during the industrialization process, how could farmers be supported? I think in the first case, especially when it comes to tertiary education, it's so unfortunate. Africa is so behind. That is where actually African countries can invest and utilize the knowledge in the West and everywhere else. This is what Asians have done. They have sent their best and brightest over the years in large numbers to the best universities in the West. They came back, set up centers of excellence. Therefore, in engineering, medicine, science, technology, and research, over the years, they supported the process of industrialization, economic management, and at the same time, the bureaucracy. I have first-hand knowledge of some countries like China and India. It's not very easy to get, a decent managerial position in India, for instance. You have to go through a lot of examination. And so the bureaucracy led by the best and the brightest, even in that chaotic place. So look at Africa. It's a mass of ignorance. Our bureaucrats generally are no better than any ordinary people. The meritocracy is not our good culture, if you want to say. So this is something the continent has to think about. The process of industrialization, it's complex. Some of it starts from even agriculture. One can take several exemplary, actually very interesting cases from China. China, for instance, never grew potato and never had chips, potato chips, And then just with a little experiment in one village, rose one of the best potato chips, etc. You know, they imported the thing from Ireland, etc. And then it became an international bestseller. So there are so many indigenous ideas in Africa. I think in every place, in every village, that has a potential to become a global good. So industrial paths depends on how we, the markets and government and the private sector partner. And in that context, I believe the farmers will be beneficiaries of technology, beneficiaries of demand for their products, beneficiaries of the financial system that supports the industrialization process. Basically, industrialization is really emerging out of the subsistence and informality. You know, it's being doing things in an organized. If you want to call it in a basic term, it's not about machines. It's about doing things in a much organized and systematic way. Whether it is farming or whether it is house cleaning, it doesn't matter. So long as you do it at a scale, it becomes an industry. This is where we have failed. We have not organized our society in a systematic and organized way. So that is my parting shot.
Yeah, thank you. Ozunimi, you brought up very important subjects like planning. I would say democratic planning as a historic challenge, which was never fulfilled in my opinion, and labor-intensive green industrialization, right?
Mm.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. Yeah. Would you like to add on that? Your final words or?
Well, I think for me, if I could pick just one thing that Africa could focus on, just one, I would say it would be planning for infrastructure growth across Africa, within Africa. If they could pick just one thing. Of course, I know every other things are important, skills, education, all that. I know all things are important, but if they could do just one thing, that would be it for me. Why? Because it would help for people to move more between the countries. You know, for the countries to be able to also, you know, build on the skills that are available in neighboring countries or the technologies that are available in neighboring countries. So for me, it's really infrastructure, and planning. Yeah.
There is a very interesting organizing initiative on the African continent, lobbying for new railroads. Well, okay, we had very important inputs, and as I said, a lot of material for future discussions on the subject. Industrialization is back on the agenda, and not only for the European Commission, also in Africa. And I'm curious to see what the ideas we will develop within the VIDC about that subject and about future events. Let me thank you very, very much about your appearing here on this webinar. Let me say that all participants should fill in a feedback form, as Martina said, that we can learn from your feedback to make it better, make it even better. And what else? Yeah, I want to invite you to visit the website of the VIDC. You will find there a lot of interesting information, podcasts, videos, publications on political economy and other subjects. And in this sense, again, thank you very much for being with us. Thank you to the audience, to the numerous audience. We're happy to have so many participants in this webinar. And let me say goodbye to you all and wish you a very nice evening and good night to Abebe, who is 2 hours behind, even behind us. Thank you and goodbye.
Goodbye.
Thank you, Abebe.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Karin, and all the colleagues.
So we'll see in another world.
Hopefully.
Hopefully. Thank you.
Thank you.